Hello! In this video, we're going to give a brief introduction to the book of Genesis. Genesis is about more than anything else about God choosing Abraham and his family as God carries out his plan of blessing the nations. There are a lot of stories, a lot of things that happen in Genesis, but we see this idea of blessing at the very center. God chooses Abraham and then later members of Abraham's family, and God is going to use them as God carries out his plan of blessing the nations. Now, we don't begin with Abraham. The story of Genesis is the story of beginnings. The story begins with the creation of the world. And so the story begins with God. And then God makes everything, and then we have humanity living with God in God's presence. But sin enters the world, human beings sin and rebel, and that sin drives humanity out of the presence of God. So the rest of the book of Genesis, and really the rest of the Bible, are answering the question, now what? So God promises deliverance, or what we might call redemption, from sin and evil. And we see right away, and throughout this book of Genesis, God's judgment and God's mercy in response to sin. In the book of Genesis, we see that God is personal. God forms close relationships with individuals and families. There's even a couple places where God makes covenants, special, formal relationships with his people. Throughout Genesis, again and again, God shows his control over the world and human history. So in Genesis, we have some big events. We have the creation of the world, we have humanity's fall into sin, and then probably the biggest event in Genesis is God's promises to Abraham. God describes the way that he's going to work throughout really the entire Old Testament, and even beyond, that God chooses this specific person and this specific family, and he works out his plan through them to bring his blessing to his world, to bring deliverance to the people he's created who have fallen into sin and evil. We also get some other famous stories in Genesis beyond the ones that I've talked about. We get stories like Noah and the flood, the Tower of Babel, Abraham almost sacrificing his son Isaac, the story of Jacob getting the blessing from his father Isaac. We get the story of Joseph and his brothers. And there's probably more famous stories, but there's a lot of things as you read Genesis that you maybe have seen before. But as we see these ideas of God blessing his people, blessing his world, blessing creation, we can point ahead and look to Jesus. That Jesus comes as a descendant of Abraham. And Jesus is the one who fulfills God's promises. Jesus is the one who brings not just blessing, but salvation to the nations. And so when we think about ourselves as we read Genesis, God makes us his people through Jesus. Through faith in Jesus, we become part of God's people. And then God uses us as a blessing to the nations, that we tell others the good news of Jesus. We act and speak in ways that show God's love. So Genesis is a book of beginnings. It's a book about God choosing people to work out his plans for blessing. And so these are some ideas that we can keep in mind to help guide us as we go through the book of Genesis. I hope that you enjoy your reading, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions as you read.